Welcome everyone to our CCF webinar. We're pleased to have several guests with us today to talk about the connections between the war on drugs and the war on terror. First of all, I wanted to let people know that CCF now has a Patreon, and if you're interested in subscribing to it to learn more about our work and to support us, the link to it will be in the chat soon, if it isn't already. Today we have with us former FBI Special Agent Mike German, now with the Brennan Center, and Beverley Carradice-Henry, whose grandson was sentenced to 20 years in an FBI terrorism sting. We're also joined by Erica Zunkel, a law professor at the University of Chicago, who has litigated what are known as stash house stings, which she will explain. And last but not least, we have Fahad Ahmed, Executive Director of DRUM, Daisy's Rising Up and Moving, who's familiar with both drug stings and terrorism stings and can help us place them into a larger context. Sting operations, where undercover agents or informants pretend to be criminals and draw the target into a crime, have been going on for a long time. I think they were first used mainly against organized crime, and then their use exploded decades ago in the war on drugs. At this point, probably the majority of drug sale cases are actually sting operations. These tend to catch a lot of small-time street dealers, not necessarily those who profit the most from the drug trade, and they tend to predominantly target Black and brown people. And this, in combination with draconian drug laws, has been the largest component in the epidemic of mass incarceration in this country. And since 9/11, sting operations have been used in a large percentage of so-called terrorism cases, even though the almost entirely Muslim targets were not engaged in terrorism before being approached by the informants. In many, if not most of these cases, the targets never would have committed a crime were it not for the informant manipulating them by offering them money or convincing them in various ways to agree to do something. Today, we're going to explore the connections between drug stings and terrorism stings and look at how both can be extremely unfair and discriminatory. I'd like to start with Mike German, former FBI undercover agent and whistleblower, who is now a fellow with the Brennan Center. Mike, it's great to have you with us. Can you talk briefly about how the FBI has come to use informants mainly against mainly Muslim targets in terrorism prosecutions since 9/11 and the unfair aspects of how this is being done?
Sure. First, thanks for having me. I appreciate being invited to talk about this important subject. And I spent 16 years at the FBI, and 12 of those years were spent working in undercover operations of one kind or another, but most specifically in domestic terrorism cases, in investigating neo-Nazi and far-right militia violence. And what I saw that led me to leave the FBI was that post 9/11, there was a sea change within the FBI about who the FBI should be investigating. And basically this was accomplished by amending the FBI's guidelines to reduce the amount of evidence necessary to justify investigating somebody. So in the 1990s, I needed to have what was the standard of evidence was a reasonable indication of criminal activity to justify targeting any particular individual in the neo-Nazi group. Obviously, hanging out with neo-Nazis, every one of them is saying things I didn't like and sounded dangerous, but I had to have actual facts indicating what type of crime this person was involved in before I could engage them in some kind of criminal activity. So as those standards went down, there was also the promotion of a theory of terrorist radicalization that was promoted that also has no factual basis, but the idea behind it is that people are exposed to radical ideas, become involved in a radical organization, and then later on become a terrorist. So if you want to stop the terrorists, you move upstream and target people who are sharing or harboring radical ideas. So because of that theory, the undercover operations moved from targeting somebody who you have a reasonable basis to believe is engaging in terrorist activities to targeting somebody you believe harbors ideas that you think are dangerous. So it's moving away from where there's evidence of criminality. And what we saw develop and this was after I left the FBI, I think was most prominent in the Liberty City 7 case in Florida, where a group of mostly African, I think entirely African-American men, some were Jamaican immigrants who were not even Muslim. It was kind of, I think, reflected the bias that was in the environment at the time, but they were targeted with an FBI informant who pretended to be part of Al-Qaeda, who lured them and encouraged them into a terrorist plot that they thought they were going to get money for. So it was essentially taking people who were not engaged in terrorism, and as the FBI would say, we're just presenting them with the opportunity to become terrorists. And that case took 3 trials before they won any convictions. The first 2 were hung, but eventually they did win convictions. And I think rather than learning that this methodology was an overreach, what they learned was we have to dress these cases up more. So that's when you started seeing, very sophisticated explosives being provided, car bombs being provided, Stinger missiles being provided, and much larger sums of money being offered to encourage people to participate in those kinds of sting operations.
Yes, and it's the Liberty City case was very similar to the Newburgh 4 case, which I know more of the details about. But they did
3 years later,
the Stinger missile in there, and they created they structured it so that there were 25-year mandatory minimums. And again, just like the Liberty City case, all these guys wanted was the money that they were being offered by the informants.
And in the Liberty City 7 case, the only weapon the group had was a ceremonial sword.
Yeah.
And so I think that the FBI realized that that was harmful to them. So if they could provide sophisticated weapons that would sit in the courtroom, it would look like a much more dangerous plot, even though it was entirely manufactured by the government. And there's no way in the Newburgh case, the defendants ever could have obtained a Stinger missile. Even the most sophisticated criminal group in the United States can't obtain a Stinger missile with millions of dollars to spend. So the idea that this group that couldn't rub 2 nickels together would somehow obtain a Stinger missile absent the government intervention is ridiculous.
Yeah, and in that case, the FBI even told the people at Stewart Air Force Base that, oh, you don't have to worry about these guys unless the informant is with them. And then, of course, they did the takedown. And
very clear that the FBI knew that these people were not dangerous on their own, but could be made to look dangerous by using an informant in a sting operation.
So many of these cases, like we've been talking about, are really classic entrapment. What you would think of is the definition of entrapment, and yet that defense has never been successful in any of these cases. Can you talk a little bit about that if you're familiar with how that works?
Sure. And part of it is that I think what lay people hear when they hear the word entrapment is just that somebody was tricked. But entrapment as a legal defense is actually incredibly narrow. The government is allowed to induce somebody to commit a crime so long as they can show the person was predicated to commit that crime. And that predication was that type of evidence prior to the case that I discussed that was necessary before 9/11. And basically the way the FBI used this radicalization theory, which they would argue in court was accurate, was that, well, if they expressed these ideas or were part of an organization that shared these ideas, or engaged in social media group discussions about these ideas, those ideas are the predication to becoming a terrorist. So instead of evidence of criminal activity, they used just that these people were, number one, Muslim, that was the first step to becoming a Muslim terrorist, was being a Muslim. So it created this pool of pre-criminals that they used as predication.
Yeah, and I think it's even worse than that in some of the cases like Newburgh and Liberty City, because they didn't even have any of those ideas, especially Newburgh.
Exactly.
They didn't even have any of those ideas. So what they argued and what they told the jury was that if they say anything to try to get the money during this sting, that shows they were predisposed before. That if they say, "Oh yeah, I'd like to do this,"
yeah,
then that
and they
shows
started
that they
using
were
this tactic that I found interesting. It's strange, and I'm shocked that judges fall for it. I can understand why juries fall for it, but they do sort of a manhood test, right? Where somewhere after they have convinced the person to engage in the plot, they will say to them, "Hey, you don't have to do this. I'll still be your friend." But the way they portray that is that, oh, they gave this person an opportunity to step off this path. But really, it's more of a manhood test in the way it's applied, because it's the leader of the plot who's making this statement, right? So it's like the general going, "Any of you privates want to, go home and not participate in the war? Go, raise your hand," right? It's not likely going to result in that, and yet they use that as evidence to justify that they were predicated before, which is completely behind when they were induced, not before.
It's so crazy the way all the tactics they use.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to turn to Beverley now. Beverley Carradice-Henry is a CCF family member whose grandson, Emanuel Lechman, a very caring and compassionate young man who unfortunately suffers from mental illness. He was caught in a sting operation, a terrorism sting operation, even though he wasn't a terrorist, and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Beverley, it's good to have you with us. Can you first talk about who Emanuel is, what he's like, and describe your relationship with him? I know you're very close to him.
Yeah. Emanuel is my grandson. I raised him because his mom died when he was 2 years old. So I raised him until he was 12. Then he went to live with his other grandmother because he wanted to know that side of family in Rochester, New York. So when he got there, before he went there, he was diagnosed with mental issues. So he had mental issues from before. And he was having issues, so he wound up getting into some trouble, wound up in jail for about 3 times. And when he came out the last time, he got married and he had a son. So he was also having marital issues also. So he was in and out, the wife would put him out, he would be in the street. So he was living in the street, sleeping in the park, having all kinds of issues going on. So the last time, after he came out, he came down here to Florida to spend some time with me because he called me his mom. I'm his mom because I raised him. And while he was here, he went back. He decided he was going back up to Rochester. He got to Rochester and he was there, going through the issues with his wife, sleeping in the streets in the park, like a vagrant. And because of he was in and out of prison, the last time he came out, he called me and he told me, he said, "Mom, the FBI is looking for me." They went to his grandmother's house looking for him. That was 2015. So I was like, "Why were they looking for you?" He said he didn't know, but he was going to go down there to find out, what was going on. So he called me after I went there. He called me. He said, "Mom, they wanted him to become an informant because he now became a Muslim. So they want him to become an informant." And he told them no. Maybe about 2 months later, he called me. He said, "Mom, I met these friends, these 3 friends, they coming from different states, and they're gonna teach him how to make T-shirts. And they became his friend. So I'm like, Emanuel, you make friends too easily. Do you know these people? He said, they're my friends, they're Muslims. And that went on for maybe a month. But, you know, he's saying these guys are his friends, and they were always around him, you know. And the next thing I knew, I get a phone call in December. That was on Christmas Eve, that he was arrested. Now, this informant, they said that he planned to go into this nightclub, and he went to Walmart, he bought zip tie and a knife. So he was gonna use zip ties and a knife to go into a nightclub by himself to attack these people in the club. So I mean, I was devastated because I never knew of him, you know, being in any trouble like that, being a terrorist or anything. Because even though he had mental issues, he's a very humble kid, loving, you know, he's sweet,
he is.
know, and I couldn't believe it. So I was devastated. You know, I'm still devastated about the whole thing. But anyway, to come to find out, he did not purchase the zip tie. He did not purchase the knife at Walmart. The informants did. They found all this, whatever they said that he have was in their car. They didn't find anything at his house. They didn't find anything on him. And then they arrest him, and then they charge him for terrorism.
Yeah.
And, you know, going through the courts, he didn't go to trial because the lawyer he had keep telling him to plead guilty, because if he didn't plead guilty, he could get 60 years. If he plead guilty, he would get 10 years. So when he went to court, they gave him 20 years and lifetime parole. So right now, you know, this was 2015, and he went to, they had him into the state prison in Pennsylvania, and they really abused him before they finally moved him to another prison. Now, at this point, he have a blood disorder, which is hereditary, called HHT. He needs to get iron infusion because the iron pill, we cannot absorb it because I have it. And I have to be on a cancer drug to help to control the bleeding. And he's not getting the medical attention that he needs in there. So right now, I haven't spoke to him in about 3 months because they took away all his privileges, and they gave him back 100 hours and phone calls. And it's been 3 months almost since I heard from him. I don't know what's going on. I don't know if he's okay. I don't know.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. They
he tried to exhaust everything, you know, every way, and everything he tried, they just lost, you know.
Yeah, we tried to help get involved with his appeal at one point, but it didn't work out. I'm so sorry about this. I know I talked to him, I think, more recently than you did. He's reading a lot of books that people are sending him. We're trying to keep him thinking positively, but it is definitely hard for him. It's so sad when people with mental illness are targeted in these sting operations too. They
didn't even bring that up in the court.
No, because it's not really considered a defense
in the courts.
Just seems so unfair. And there's a lot of cases where people were asked to be an informant first, and when they say no, then they get targeted in these cases too.
And that's what happened, because even his ex-wife told me, she said, well, if he had accepted the job to become an informant, he would have been in jail. I'm like, but he don't want to be an informant, so you can't say that, because he does not believe in that. He didn't want to be an informant. So, if he became an informant, he would be putting innocent people in jail also. And he didn't want that, not knowing that he would fall into this trap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, I'm so sorry. I hope we can figure out something that we can do for him. But at this point, I'd like to bring in Erica Zunkel. She's a clinical professor of law at the University of Chicago, an associate director of the Federal Criminal Justice Clinic there. And she's litigated a particularly unfair type of drug sting called stash house stings, which she'll explain. Welcome, Erica. Can you tell us what these stash house stings are?
Thank you, Kathy, for having me. And I just wanted to acknowledge Beverly's story, and my heart really breaks for you and your family. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to, hear that. And it's a reminder of how devastating these stings are, whether it's the stash house sting or a terrorism, sting. It's wasting people's lives and so much potential, and there's so much loss. So the fake stash house sting is pretty much what it sounds like. This is a tactic that the government has been using since the 1980s. It began at the height of the war on drugs. And it was seen, and presented as a way to somehow get, the worst of the worst. That's at least how the government has defended the fake stash house sting. And what we know from working on a number of these cases is that just has not been borne out in reality at all. The people that are targeted are very vulnerable, sometimes have mental health or substance abuse issues. And the whole playbook of what the government does is they use an informant to go target an individual and say, hey, do you want to rob this stash house? There's going to be lots of drugs, easy payday is essentially how it's described. And oftentimes this is a lot of conversation between the informant and the person that's being targeted. We had and have had people who were targeted at their jobs. So these are people who are contributing to society, doing everything that we would want them to do. And an informant pops up and says, hey, let's talk. So the government is creating the crime, and then they're targeting people to commit it. There's no stash house, there's no drugs. Everything is a complete fabrication. But in these conversations that the informants and the undercover agents have with the targets, they're building up, you need to bring people to this. So, once the initial target agrees, then it's, we need a crew of people to do this. So go get your friends. And then they're bringing in friends. Oh, and by the way, this, fictitious stash house is going to be guarded by people with guns. So now you're going to have to bring guns, and encouraging people to bring weapons. Even when people would say, I can't find anything. I don't know what to do. I don't have a gun. I don't have anything that I can bring, still encouraging. And then, of course, the government is making up the amount of drugs that's going to be in this fake stash.
Oops. I think you might be frozen. Let's see.
So they say there's going to be, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. I got the internet is unstable, right, which I never like getting. And so the way that federal law works is that the sentences are set by how much, how many, the amount of drugs that's talked about, the guns. So quickly, someone agrees to do this and they're looking at a 10-year mandatory minimum or more based on the amount of drugs that the undercover agent and informant have come up with. They're then facing a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence if there's a gun involved. So that's just a baseline of 15 years. And then there can be sentencing enhancements if people have certain prior convictions. So the sentences add up really quickly. And what the informant and undercover agent do is get everybody to come on the day of arrest, and then they arrest everybody. Of course, everything is a fabrication, and then things go from there. So it's an incredibly troubling practice. I first saw stash house stings when I was a public defender in San Diego. And they were, I think the government was doing them because they saw them as sort of low-hanging fruit. It was easy. It was an easy playbook to trot out. It was easy to get paid informants to be involved in this. And then it was really easy to get convictions because they had these draconian mandatory minimum sentences hanging over people's heads. And so people are rationally saying, I don't want to go to prison for a mandatory minimum term of life behind this, fake made up crime. So I'm going to plead guilty. And then when I came to Chicago, we, in conjunction with the federal defender and criminal defense community here, decided to try to attack these stings on the basis that they were racially discriminatory, because what is very clear from the data in Chicago and around the country is that it's predominantly, Black men who are being targeted for these crimes. So we did many years of litigation to try to expose that, and have had, the success here in Chicago of having the government actually stop, charging these cases.
So you argued the discrimination, but how did that go legally? And even if it wasn't successful legally, you can talk about the effect it had that the government pulled back. And are they still doing this, or did they stop? Are they backed off a bit?
So they, as I mentioned, they had charged these cases to the hilt. There were 94 people in Chicago between, the early 2000s to the later 2000s that were charged in connection with the fake stash house cases. We ended up representing 43 of those people on this race discrimination litigation. And what we were trying to do is overcome very unfavorable law in this area. It's just, the law is not a way to get justice in these cases, unfortunately, because the standards for what you have to prove, whether you're talking about using entrapment as a defense, that's incredibly hard to do, or if you're talking about racially selective prosecution or law enforcement, because you have to show discriminatory effect and discriminatory intent. So the law has set really high bars, and we did our damnedest to bring statistical evidence. We hired, a criminologist and Jeff Fagan, Professor Jeff Fagan of Columbia, to, look at all of the cases, look at, the people's backgrounds, look at what the ATF's purported criteria was. And, what he ultimately concluded was there's no way that 92% of the people that are targeted happen to be Black men by chance. That would not happen. And we had, the government had a dueling statistical expert, and ultimately one judge of many who were hearing these cases decided against us on our motion, which was a real blow because we felt like we had presented the best possible case that you could, given the law and the facts. But what it led to was the government deciding to use its discretion and drop all the most serious charges. So they were using their discretion on the front end to load people up with charges. And then what they decided to do was, hey, we're going to walk away from all the mandatory minimums, and you can plead to a non-mandatory minimum offense and argue for a time served sentence. So it ended up that all of the 43 clients who were a part of this litigation ended up pleading guilty to this very favorable plea agreement. Of course, that meant that they had to walk away from the motion to dismiss the charges because of, racially discriminatory law enforcement. But the upside was that they were able to, secure their freedom and be with their families. It also had the effect in Chicago of causing the government to say, we're not going to, prosecute these cases anymore. We're not going to bring them. So in Chicago, at least, this practice is not happening anymore, which is a huge victory. But I think one of the concerns that I have is these things tend to pop up. They pop up again in different forms, a slightly different playbook. And so I think we have to be extra vigilant to take the lessons that we've learned here and other places and make sure we're preventing these from coming up again.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you won the victory basically in Chicago to get them to stop doing it. And I hope that example spreads elsewhere, or maybe it already has. And I know also one of the cases did go up on appeal to the Seventh Circuit where this, maybe that was the outrageous government misconduct argument and also racial discrimination. And again, because the law is so bad, and the same thing with entrapment, like you said, the convictions weren't reversed, but the court did note how unfair this is. I think I'll read a quote from that a little bit later, but I think also some of the people that weren't able to get out of the people that did go to trial and got the really long sentences, some of them got compassionate release. And I think you're involved with some of that now. Can you talk about that a little bit? Yeah, that's right.
So after we concluded, working on this race discrimination litigation and working on the sentencing for several individual clients, we were still really, really troubled by the fact that there were, I think 25 to 30 people who were still in prison, who had been arrested in connection with these cases in Chicago, but just the timing was such that they were not able to be part of our litigation. And so they couldn't take advantage of the dismissal of the charges and the reduced sentences. And we saw an opening in federal compassionate release to try to argue that because of the government's disavowal in Chicago of this, of doing fake stash house stings and the sentencing disparities between our clients who were still in prison and serving these really long sentences, and the people who were out and were free and were with their families, we were saying that didn't make any sense. That was no type of justice, and that judges should use, their mercy through compassionate release to let people go early. And we filed 3 motions last year. We had 2 that were granted. We are continuing to file the motions, even though the law in the Seventh Circuit where we practice is getting worse and worse. But we really feel like this is the continued work that needs to be done because there are so many people in Chicago and around the country that are still in prison for really long periods of time because of this fake sting. So we will continue to work on that. We're continuing to work on clemency for Stash House clients because we don't want anyone to be left behind.
Well, thank you for all the work you've been doing on that. And I used some of those compassionate release grants in the motions that we now have pending for the Newburgh 4 people, because it's so similar.
Yeah, I'm glad you're able to use that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. I'd like to turn to Fahad Ahmed now. He's the longtime executive director of DRUM, a CCF coalition partner. Fahad, we can talk about your experience with some of these cases maybe in a minute, but I just want to get your reaction to a couple of quotes. One from this Stash House sting appeal that I mentioned, and also one from the Newburgh case. And these convictions were not reversed. The sentences were not reduced, at least not yet. In United States v. Conley, the 7th Circuit court, where the defense had argued that the case should be dismissed for outrageous governmental conduct and racial discrimination, the court said, these stings are troubling in several ways. First, the agents in these stings blindly encourage the initial target to rope in a large group of co-conspirators who otherwise may have stayed out of trouble. Second, the vast majority of defendants caught in these stings have been poor people of color. Third, these stings give law enforcement free rein to manipulate sentences by setting imaginary drug amounts. But that wasn't enough to reverse the conviction. And then in the Newburgh case, the judge said, it is beyond question that the government created the crime here. The government dangled what had to be an almost irresistible temptation in front of an impoverished man from what I have come to view as the saddest and most dysfunctional community in the Southern District of New York. From the perspective of the citizens of Newburgh, who are frequently targeted by various government operations, I can well understand why the FBI's conduct is seen as both outrageous and incomprehensible. But she didn't reverse the convictions, and she didn't go below the mandatory minimum. Hopefully she will now with our compassionate release motions. But can I get your reaction to that and kind of generally what we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think, Erica made this point around like sort of a reference to just because something is a law or the operation of law doesn't mean that it's just. And I think, the problem that we have is that these things keep repeating themselves. One, because most often, if any court or, like policymakers do find some fault in this, they really see it as like an isolated incident. If you're really lucky, you get like some of these class action lawsuits, like, all right, like there seems to be a little bit of a pattern going on here. But the reality is that there's actually like a historical continuity of these sorts of things across American history, right? And the reason that like we keep seeing these patterns over and over is because we don't acknowledge sort of like the full history and the full patterns of it. We see the use of this kind of surveillance. Well, we see the use of surveillance, infiltration, and sowing of dissension from like even before the founding of the US, right? In the encounters with indigenous peoples and sort of like how divide and conquer was used. We see it in, there's lots of documentation of amongst enslaved peoples, sort of like how certain people were picked to sort of spy and report things back. And then like we sort of see a more formalization of this with the Red Squads and then the targeting of organized crime. But it's really, and Mike German may know this a little bit better, but at that point it was largely in infiltration and surveillance, but it's really with COINTELPRO in the 60s and 70s, where it was the FBI's program to target anti-war activists, to target Black activists, that it moved from just surveillance and infiltration to actual like trying to agitate people to commit crimes. Because it was, you've already criminalized somebody in thought, and then you enact like sort of how do we bend the rules to like sort of like make this come to fruition. And that's really the continuity, like coming out of COINTELPRO that we see then in the war on drugs cases and that we now see in the war on terror cases. And so, like, I think it is good when we see these instances where the judges pick something up. Most of the time, their hands are tied to really actually be able to do anything from it. But even in the few instances that they do something, it just pops up again because we haven't really talked about this as a whole trajectory and a whole pattern that's very much enmeshed in the fabric of American history and tied to notions of what communities are included, what communities are not, who's worthy, who's not, who's worthy of being considered to have been given a second chance or have alternative considerations, and who's not, who's just automatically presumed guilty. And so, I think it's, we take what we can when we get it from the courts, but we also have to continue to dig deeper.
Yeah, and we in CCF, we look at the concept of sort of like what you were talking about, preemptive prosecution, where they are looking at, okay, these people are Muslim who have and are critical of US foreign policy, and therefore they're suspicious, and therefore we're going to target them. And they're not committing any crimes, but we're going to either get them on immigration violations, try to get them to be informants, or we're going to target them in a sting operation, or we're going to get them on some kind of material support charge. We're going to get them one way or the other. We're not going to just let them go off on their own, because there's a slight chance that someday they might become radicalized or become engaged in some act of violence against the United States. And so we're going to go after them beforehand. And we don't care how many lives we destroy in the process, or like with the stash house sting cases, we're going to target these people who maybe have no money and dangle all this money in front of them. And, of course, lots of people are going to go for something like that. So it's a matter of who you target. You could target like different groups of people and get the same result. Maybe you change the tactics, but that just shows how incredibly discriminatory and abusive it is.
Yeah. I think one thing I would add, though, is that there are patterns in terms of who they target, right? If you look at like Red Squads or COINTELPRO, like it's when movements are rising up to challenge the government and challenge society around the ways that like it is discriminatory or the injustices that exist. The war on drugs very much parallels sort of like economic changes in the US, as like we see deindustrialization, we see white flight, we see these concentrations of like largely Black communities in the inner cities, and the war on drugs becomes a way to deal with these folks that have been deprived of jobs, and it is, if not lucrative, then like sort of like socially easier to incarcerate them. And then with the war on terror, it is very much tied to the wars abroad, right? It's not a coincidence that the communities that are being targeted domestically are very much the same or similar communities that our government is also engaged in wars with abroad. And so a lot of this targeting and like in many of these cases, like we see it like very clearly, like when the NYPD in New York, like sort of like had its first handful of cases of like where, informants or undercovers were used, arrested. Immediately after those cases, they would come and be like, this is why we need more funding, right? So it comes around funding for like law enforcement. And then we see on the national level that politicians would pick up these cases, small, sometimes local cases, and be like, look, this is why we're fighting for our freedoms in Afghanistan and Iraq or like whatever, to try to justify and legitimize the wars that are ongoing. And so like there is like cyclical kind of pattern there in terms of like how it feeds itself.
I certainly agree with that. And so can you, and we'll open up this to others too, but can you give us some thoughts about the best way to fight against this stuff, as you've been doing with Drum for a really long time? And then we'll hear from other people on that too.
So because these are very complicated, like multi-layered issues, right? Like if we think about like sort of a tie-in to wars abroad, to like large funding for local and federal law enforcement, to the impact on communities, to the impact on individuals. We do need like multiple strategies to be able to address it, right? We need people that are doing policy-based work. We need people that are doing legal work. But one of the things I think we found is that there is something that can be done from the on the very grassroots level, from like the individual cases, which we found is, you know, if we bring up a case of like, oh, this person was targeted by an informant and is now serving 30 years in prison, and you know, you could present all the evidence and all the glaring things in the case, but like people's fear factor remains, right? Like people's fear factor that's kind of been drilled into them, like very easily kicks in. They're like, yeah, it doesn't sound right, but I don't know, I'd rather be safe. And like, sure, like some people's rights will be lost, but like that's how the world is, right?
It kind of flips the burden of proof on its head, like, yeah. Yeah,
but what helps is that like, if we, you know, like because we've been working locally in the community, we can actually talk about like sort of like all the increasing steps of the surveillance apparatus, like just the quiet surveillance of mosques. When the NYPD's reports were leaked from the Associated Press in 2011, they had a list of like the 200 plus mosques in New York City, where they knew who the imam was, who the congregation was, what were the political leanings, what forces were they connected to back home. You know, like that's kind of like the lowest level. Then you see the medium level where like some people are being asked to become informants. Somebody gets caught up in a small minor drug case, and then either that young person or that person's father, who's on the board of a masjid, has said like, we'll drop his case if you become a spy for us. When you put those two levels, then the third level, which is where like somebody's actually been actively entrapped, like that starts to make more sense. Oh, okay, so the informants are quietly spying, the informants are agitating people or like trying to recruit people. And then when they're not succeeding, then they're like proactively like trying to incite people. And that's kind of like in 2011, once we started fighting back against like the leaks that came out around the NYPD reports. The reports didn't tell us anything new. We already knew all of these things, but it became evidence for us to say like, look, here's the whole spectrum of the surveillance apparatus. And so now when we talk about the most egregious cases, you can see sort of like how it's in increasing levels of like all the previous levels. And then it really started to click. It started to click with like other people that were engaged in social movements that have also both historically been targeted and continue to be targeted. And then even just in communities, like it started to resonate. And so that allowed us to like sort of build coalitions where people were saying like, look, this is not right. And, you know, I think it's been, in terms of systematically, I think like sort of like the rollback of the NYPD surveillance apparatus is like one of the kind of outstanding kind of examples. It's not to say that they've stopped. They've largely combined their operations in with the FBI through like the Joint Terrorism Task Force, but like sort of like their own operations that they were doing have been severely reduced. I don't think we've seen an NYPD only case in like more than like 6 or 7 years. And, you know, I think these stories and then like working with those families becomes the way to like actually go out and like talk to other communities. And you know, like it's really like those families that particularly CCF and organizations like DRUM have like supported, developed their leadership to go tell their stories, to go to churches, to go to community centers, to go talk to media, that it actually starts to spread that like, look, these are real human beings, these are families, these are communities, here are the impacts. And you know, like sort of like, I think like maybe Mike hinted at it and then Beverly as well, like sort of like the devastation that the families endure. I mean, there are families whose own families stop talking to them because they have now been so stigmatized. The families are like, if I talk to my sister, like maybe the FBI will come after me. And you know, like we work with like several of these families where like people have been completely cut off, not only from their communities, not only from society, but even from their own families, their own blood. And like the devastation of like sort of having a loved one locked away. For every one of these families, every day that their loved one is in prison, the families on the outside are serving every day of that sentence with them. Every single day. Every phone call they get is just a reminder that they are collectively suffering.
Yeah, that's so true.
True.
But,
very true.
yeah. What you were saying about working with the community to try to prevent some of this stuff and teach people what to watch out for and how to see the unfairness of it, so that maybe there won't be so many different sting operations. We had that happen in Albany, New York. We had a particularly outrageous case of Yasin Aref and Mohammed Hussein. That's what got me and some other people from Albany involved in these kinds of cases back in 2006, 2004, 2006. And after that, there hasn't been another sting operation in Albany, even though they were convicted and sentenced to 15 years. There was a movement in Albany, both non-Muslim and non-Muslim, that really came together and worked with the media and community churches, mosques, and really fought back against the narrative that the government was trying to push. And I think very successfully, even though we couldn't prevent the convictions. I think we got lower sentences than it would have been otherwise, but there has not been another sting operation like that in Albany since then. And you know, this is happening in some other communities too. So I guess I'd like to open it up to Erica and Mike and Beverly to see if you have thoughts about that also, like what can be done about it, whether legal or organizing strategies, any kind of anything that might help.
So I'll commend the work of both DRUM and the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, because I think that education, both for the community and most important from my perspective, the media. I mean, one of the problems with those early sting cases is the sensationalized media that came after the arrest, where, you know, they would highlight the car bomb and, you know, take the government's word for what happened 100% and talk about that for the 9 months to a year before it went to trial, when you'd start to find that maybe the story wasn't quite as the government portrayed it, where, you know, by the time the Newburgh sting case had ended, the trial had ended, as soon as one of these sting operations is announced, I get a call from journalists saying, is this another one of those bogus sting operations? And, you know, what are the hallmarks? What do I look for? So I think they've really done a disservice to effective law enforcement in a number of ways. One, that they've turned counterterrorism into this gotcha game with people who are not terrorists, right? They're targeting marginalized communities and people with mental health issues because they're the easiest to dupe into these programs. And that doesn't harm any of those foreign terrorist organizations. In fact, to the extent that the government is sensationalizing those prosecutions, they're doing the terrorism for the terrorist groups, right? ISIS and Al-Qaeda don't need to create a plot in the United States. The FBI is manufacturing these plots and then promoting them as, look how successful we are. But that is still spreading fear throughout the United States of these foreign terrorist groups that had nothing to do with it. Never heard of these people before.
That's a really good point.
Right? It's incredibly stupid, but also undermining confidence in our institutions. And I think that has led directly to where we are now as a nation, where people don't know what to believe anymore. And, you know, if we can't trust what the FBI says in these sting cases, can we trust them in regular criminal cases? And that has created a system where a demagogue can get up and say, the institutions are broken. I'm the only one who's not corrupted, and you give all the power to me and I will do this. You know, one of the interesting things about the terrorism stings, and, you know, may explain why in these fake stash houses, why they don't target white defendants, is because when the tactic is used against white terrorists, it's not as successful. and judges and juries are a lot more aggressive in questioning the evidence. There was a case in 2015, a militia group, a white militia group in Michigan called the Hootery Militia, where it was the similar tactic. And in that case, there was actually some criminal predication, right? This was a group that had gone out before the government got involved and obtained the illegal weapons. So they were involved in some illegal activity, but rather than focus the investigation on the illegal activity, they tried to aggrandize it the way they got used to in targeting these Muslim groups, and brought in an informant who created a spectacular plot. And when it went to trial, the judge, he didn't rule on an entrapment defense. He ruled that the conspiracy the government alleged wasn't a real conspiracy because it was all made up by the informant, and that the defendants had not engaged in sufficient agreement that that's what they were going to do. So he ended up throwing that portion of the case out. And now we see in this Michigan militia case, right, and it still hasn't gone to trial, so we don't have all the facts. And I'm open-minded about whether the defense allegations are true, but if half of them are true, right, it's a similar kind of thing where rather than focus on whatever criminal activity might have been present, they tried to manufacture a much bigger plot. And you know, again, it's different because, you know, the reason they had to resort to manufacturing cases in the international terrorism case is that we're a very fortunate country and we don't face a lot of international terrorism incidents in the United States. But they had demanded all these new authorities, all these new resources, and had to show some progress. So rather than targeting the very small number of terrorists that might be doing harm, they had to manufacture cases, and this became a way to do that. But when you talk about white supremacist violence and far-right militant violence, you don't have to manufacture cases. There are people out there doing harm, but right, rather than targeting them, the methodology they've come up with is the same sting methodology that is targeting people who are not necessarily the people who are actually creating the harm, and they still seem to be ignoring the people who are committing harm in communities all across the United States.
Yeah, I think after 9/11, they had this idea that there were all these sleeper cells, or they wanted to believe that, or they did believe that, I don't know, but right, then it turned out it wasn't true. So then they had to create all these cases, and then it became such an easy conviction in a box kind of model that they right, started expanding it. And that Hootery case, that's interesting because I read that decision and I used it in a post-conviction motion for two of the Fort Dix 5 defendants, G10 and Shane Duca, because they were convicted of a conspiracy to kill unknown people in an unknown place at an unknown time and got sentenced to life in prison
right,
for that. And there was no conspiracy in that. So I used the Hootery case to say, look, here, there was a lot more, and it got thrown out for not having enough to have a conspiracy. And here, how can you possibly be doing this to these guys, these brothers? But of course that didn't work for various right, reasons. And now it's up on appeal, but that's probably not going to work. But the Michigan case will be interesting because there were so many informants involved in that case. And because of the kind of racism in our society, those cases are more likely to be successful than the cases that target Muslims or people of color. It's very aggravating, but let's see, I guess we're almost out of time for our 1 hour. We could go over a little bit, but I guess I'd like to hear from Beverly if you have anything to add to this, or Erica, or back to Fahad again.
No, my thing is, you know, what can we do as a people, you know, to stop this kind of craziness from happening? Because, you know, family, it's impact families, and families do suffer from, you know, these sting operations. And, you know, the government get away with doing this thing. I mean, it's like it's a legal crime. They committed a legal crime, you know? And what can we, as a people, what can we do?
Certainly causes a lot of harm. It causes so much harm.
You know, you're talking about, you know, a lifetime probation. That means for a crime that the government committed, I'm saying the government committed it, and you're giving this person 20 years plus lifetime probation. That means what's happened with their lives? What happened, you know, when they come out in 20 years, what happened? What's next?
And that's a new thing too. It used to be like 3 years or 5 years probation afterwards. Now a lot of times it's 20 years, 30 years lifetime, which sometimes can get terminated early, but it's just skyrocketed the amount of time of supervision even after they get out of prison, if they get out of prison.
It's really sad.
Yeah.
It's horrible. And I think as a society, we've become numb. We haven't even really grappled with what it means for somebody to be on supervision for 10 and 20 years and what these 10, 20, 30 life sentences mean. I remember appearing in front of judges in San Diego, and one judge would say, you know, at sentencing, oh, you'll be so surprised how fast the time goes. It sounds like it's a long time that I'm sentencing you. You know, it's 5 years, but it'll fly by. And I was always just, it made me sick to hear that, because of course we know the people on the other side of it. We know the families, we see the damage. And I really think that, getting back to Kathy's question about what can we do, it has to be a multi-pronged approach. I mean, the law has real limits, but, you know, to the extent we can do things within the law, it's fighting everything so that it's not easy for the government to bring the cases and to take the cases to trial and you know, to get long sentences, because that's how they back down on the legal side of things. But it's also, you know, getting these stories into the media and having people become invested and care about it. Because when I talk to people and I say, this is what fake stash house stings are, people who have no knowledge of the law say, that just sounds wrong. Mm-hmm. How can the government do this? How is that legal? You know, how, and if it's legal, how does it make sense? How is it justice? And I think that the more that we can just get out and tell the stories and tell, you know, have family members like Beverley come and tell their stories of how this is impacting people, that's how we can change minds. And also to come together and talk about these things, because like Fahd said, there's so many similarities between what the government is doing in all these different areas, and they're expecting us to not put it all together and to just say, well, we're doing this little thing in this area, but people who are working on drug stings, those are kind of over for now. So those people, you know, stop bothering us about that, so we can do these other cases. And like we've all said, they continue to pop up, and the government being so well resourced, and these cases, you know, being easy for them, they're going to continue doing them, you know, where they can. So keep fighting. That's my thought.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think the long sentences with the terrorism enhancement, and particularly the long post-confinement oversight, is a product of the embrace of this radicalization theory that is totally false. It's been disproven through empirical research over and over again. But the premise is that, you know, something happens to the person's mind. I mean, the government actually refers to it as an infection. You're infected by these radical ideas. And once you're radicalized, it might take you 20 years to commit a terrorist attack. So you're dangerous for the rest of your life. And there's no basis in reality to justify this. And, you know, Trevor Aronson wrote a book called The Terror Factory, and did a lot of research at I believe Mother Jones magazine, where you can see that a lot of these cases. And he talks about one of the things that he did very well is part of the problem is the people who are caught in these stings don't have anything to trade with the government. So when it comes to those plea negotiations, they don't know anyone in Al-Qaeda. They don't know any actual terrorists. There's nobody that they can pivot and say, I'll give you information about this other bad person, because they don't know anyone. So it's this perverse result where people who have actual connections to a terrorist group get sentenced to much lower sentences and are treated much more kindly by the system than the people that they're roping into these sting operations who don't have any actual relationship to terrorism. So I think that the publication of this information, and particularly working with families, because the isolation that's created by these accusations is hard to overcome, and that's why I really credit a lot of the work that all the people here have been doing, because that's really important to make sure that we're empowering the communities to resist this kind of misconduct.
Yeah, and we have a database of cases, and we've seen, because we've been keeping track of all the cases basically since 9/11, we've seen a lot of people serve these 10, 15, 20-year sentences and then get released. And some of them have been released for quite a while. Not one of them has committed any act of terrorism or even been arrested for anything like that again. Not one of them. So it's crazy. I guess, Fahad, do you want to have some final thoughts? And I guess if somebody else wants to have final thoughts, that would be fine too. And then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I think, sort of, we talked a little bit about sort of the similarities between the war on drugs and the war on terror. But, like these are issues that are patterns across law enforcement. One of the ways that we were really able to bring up these cases was facilitating relationships between the mothers of the young people that were in the war on terror.
Oops, thank you.
Usually sons were killed. I'll turn my video off for a minute. We facilitated relationships between mothers whose loved ones were targeted in the war of terror and mothers whose sons were killed by the NYPD. And a lot of what they talked about is sort of like how their loved ones got smeared by law enforcement and by the media. And that then just sort of created a situation to where the possibility of justice was not there. And so, I think that's a lot of it is we have to keep looking for links, keep looking for patterns, keep looking for root causes around why these things are happening. And then I think part of it's also just we also have to really start to question as a society, people, while I think most of the vast majority of these cases are actually manufactured, but even just what is our approach to people making mistakes, to people doing harm, to people actually committing or trying to commit really serious or violent acts. And if we think about sort of we have 2.5 million people in the carceral system in the US, the largest in the world. Our police funding is the size, I think it adds up to be the 5th largest military in the world if you combine all of our police departments. 2 years ago, NYPD invested $250 million to put cops in the subway station to prevent $200 million of subway theft. You spend $250 million to prevent 200 million. In New York City public schools, for many years, our policing budget was $400 million a year, but those same schools didn't have books that were recent. We had young people going to schools that the history books were 20 years old. What kind of history are you teaching? So this is really a lot of the questions that people are asking around what kind of society are we trying to build? Of course, people are going to mess up, either mistakes, actual, are we trying to rectify it, or is it just sort of a society where we punish and then try to forget people? And as long as we have that approach, it'll just recreate the hierarchies of like, okay, who are the people that are worthy of being put away, and who are the people who actually. So I think like, you know, there's a lot of these conversations that we can really like sort of like delve into and seek solutions and really start to reshape society.
All right, does anybody else have anything to add before we wrap up? I'd like to thank all of you for being here. It's been an important conversation, and I hope we can continue to talk about these things, because there's certainly a lot to talk about and a lot to work on.
I would just like to say that I thank CCF for their support, you know, because before I found out about CCF, I was really devastated, and I've got a lot of support from the group, and I want to say thank you, God. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to have you, and I wish there was a lot more we could do.
Yeah, we just have to keep, I don't know, keep praying.
Yeah.
That's all I can do, is just pray, you know.
All right. Well, thanks to all of you for being with us today. And we'll wrap it up there.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.